In our last lesson, we discussed how the story of the American Revolution doesn't begin strictly in 1776, and that we actually need to go back a little bit to get the context. Today, we start that. We begin in 1754 with what is called the French and Indian War. The Europeans call this the 7 Years' War. It is another war between France, Britain, and Spain that once again takes place across the globe. The Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans saw great naval battles, and there was land skirmishes on India, in Africa, in Europe, and in North America. Now, in North America, the fighting was largely between British colonists, the American colonists, on one hand, and French colonists and their Native American allies on the other hand. The reason that there was this division between these two sides comes down to a land dispute. However, there was also a cultural difference. The way that France interacted with Native Americans and the way that the British interacted with Native Americans were not the same. The French occupied much of Canada and the Mississippi River Valley, and whenever they worked with Native Americans, they often traded very heavily and often would intermarry or be adopted into certain Native American clans. They would earn Native American names even. Their encounters with the Native Americans were not so heavily dominated by land acquisition. On the other hand, the British, whenever they encountered the Native Americans, often wanted to own the land that the Native Americans were using. This would involve treaties, of course, and also the sale and giving of goods, but often there was a little bit of pushback on both sides, and the British were continually greedy for more and more land. So whenever these two sides would have conflict, the French on the one hand and the British on the other, often the Native Americans found it in their best interest to ally with the French. Now, this particular war, the 7 Years' War, is based on a land dispute that mostly takes place in the upper United States around the Great Lakes. The actual troop movements of that land dispute aren't particularly necessary for our story on the American Revolution. But I do want to point out a couple very specific facts about the French and Indian War that contributes to the American Revolution. The first thing I'd like to point out is that hostilities began in 1754 with George Washington. At that time, he was 22 years old. He was leading some British militia and was involved in a skirmish. The fighting actually began with George Washington's actions. He would be later captured at one point, released at another point, and he began to learn something very, very important about how the French and how the Native Americans were able to move. Now remember, at this time, these battlefields were actually in the midst of thick forests. And one thing he noticed is that the redcoats, the British redcoats, were able to be seen from a great distance by Native American scouts who blended in so well with the territory. It seemed like they could never catch the Native Americans. He began to learn that a much smaller force in that kind of an environment could still win against a larger force. That's an important lesson for him to learn because 20 years later, whenever he was commander of the Continental Army, he would have a smaller force, but he would see those redcoats coming miles away. Another thing to keep in mind is that this war was extremely expensive. At that time, the Prime Minister of Britain was a Prime Minister named William Pitt. In order to pay for this war, he began borrowing very heavily for the government. A lot of the money actually came across the Atlantic to the United States, what would become the United States. And many of the continental militia and citizens were paid to work as soldiers for the British. So what ends up happening there is that they get very good experience with this kind of frontier fighting. That'll be useful in 20 years. But also, Britain goes heavily into debt. They begin borrowing very, very large sums of money, unable to pay it back. And by the end of the war, although they win, they are deeply in debt. And France is as well. The third thing I'd like to point out is that the French and the Indians lose this war. It actually goes very badly for both France and their Indian allies. There's a peace treaty in which Spain and France and Britain all come together, and they negotiate about where certain land is going to be given. The British are going to take control of all of Canada and all of the Mississippi River Valley. Of course, that land is already occupied, and not by British citizens. It's occupied by Frenchmen and Native Americans. And just with the signing of a pen, that land transfers to the British side. The Native Americans were never consulted. Immediately, this opens up a very interesting question for the British colonists. They had been wanting to push west. They had reached the Appalachian Mountains, and they knew that there was wonderful land on the other side. They knew where the Mississippi River was. They knew that that land between Appalachia and Mississippi was full of fantastic groves of trees and great areas where land could easily produce crops. In fact, people over on the East Coast perhaps could buy a bunch of that land and then sell it for a larger price to people moving west. This was called land speculation. However, when the British took over that land, the king knew that the American colonists were wanting to push west, and so he made a decree. It's called the Proclamation of 1763. And he basically said that down Appalachia, right down the middle of Appalachia, was a line, and that the American colonists could not cross that line. If they in fact already lived on that side of the line, they had to move back. On one side, from Appalachia to the East Coast, that's where the British could live. But from Appalachia to the Mississippi River, that was Indian territory. That's where the Native Americans were going to live. And so that royal proclamation became law. You can imagine that a lot of Americans who were wanting to move west or wanting to make money on people moving west found that law to be reprehensible. It was, in short, impinging on their liberties to make money and to secure their own finance and fortune. So a number of things came out of the French and Indian War. Number one, the great powers, Britain and France, were both heavily in debt. Number two, the colonials, including George Washington, learned how to fight in difficult woodland terrain. And number three, there was a royal proclamation that divided British territory, a royal proclamation that Americans did not like. We'll look more at the results of the French and Indian War in later lessons.